So this is your syllabus for CUET. Okay. And some of the major universities that will be covered under CUET: JNU, Delhi University or Delhi School of Economics. Then we have HCU, we have let's say DTU, Delhi Technological University. Then we have many central universities, state level central universities. Am I audible clearly? Okay. So this is something that we need to look into. Second is your syllabus for IITJAM. Okay. So if you look at the syllabus of, let's say we start with microeconomics, and if when we start with microeconomics, you'll see that the IIT syllabus and the CVT syllabus, there is some amount of overlap, and that overlap is around 80, even to 80 to 90%. Okay. However, there's a difference in terms of asking questions. Okay. So, like when we are talking about consumer theory, you will see that this they have given about the demand, they have given about the utility, they have given about the indifference curve. But what we need to understand is this utility. What are the types of utility? Okay. What are the different types of utility? This is something is important not only for JAM but also for CUET. Okay. When we are talking about the indifference curve, then what is the relationship between the utility and indifference curve? Like what values of utility will give us what kind of indifference curve? We know about theory of revealed preference. Then in this, what happens that you will get different kind of sets, and then we will be asked about your preferences. We are talking about consumer surplus. Then the question is how to calculate graphical theory through numerical. Then they have not added many of the topics over here. Topics like when we are talking about consumer surplus or consumer theory, there are many things like elasticity. They have not talked about elasticity. They have not talked about, let's say, income effect, substitution effect. They have not talked about price consumption curve, income consumption curve. So these are some of the things that we need to look into, even though these are not explicitly mentioned in the syllabus. Okay. So we'll be covering a syllabus. We'll be using this CUET and JAM syllabus as a reference point, but we'll go a bit in details. Okay. So the question is, before we start with our basic microeconomics, let's talk about our approach. Okay. The first thing that you need to look at is previous papers. Why previous papers? Previous papers will help us to understand how questions are asked. Okay. How questions can be asked from any particular topic. Why? Because when we look at previous paper earlier, we know that yes, JNU had its own examination, DSE had its own examination, let's say HCU has its own examination, or Pondicherry or Center for Development Studies, all these institutions had their own examination. However, if we take a simple example of utility, the way in which JNU asked question from utility is different from the way in which DSE asked. Now, when we are talking about JAM or even CUET, we don't know how the questions can be asked. So the best thing to study is study everything, all the patterns. Okay. So when we are preparing, it will help us understand what are the topics in which the questions can be asked. So when we are covering previous year papers, what I will be doing is that we'll be providing previous papers for JNU also, DSE also, HCU also, CDS, Pondicherry. Then you have South Asian University. Okay, this is a Delhi-based university which you can also refer to. So these are some of the major universities, and then you can for basic question as a question bank, you can also look at JMI paper. Okay, we'll be not covering ISI because their standard and pattern of asking question is quite different. So this is the first step that we need to understand. Therefore, whenever you are preparing for any topic, you must be aware like what kind of ways in which and what are the topic in which the questions have been asked. The second thing that you need to understand is the classes. Okay. So along with the classes, we'll be giving you the complete study material. Okay. Now the study material has been prepared, and you will find that in your Google Drive also the study materials that we have added. You'll find that the study material that we have prepared is a comprehensive study material in a way that you don't have to refer to any book, but we still recommend students that yes, you can look at the some of the textbook which you might have studied at the undergrad level. The third part is your question bank. Okay. So question bank will be giving you the question bank topic wise of like within microeconomics. Let's see if there are 6 7 chapters. So first each of these chapters will be getting the question bank. Okay. Apart from that, we'll be giving question bank for the complete topics like 100 question for micro, 100 question for macro, 100 question for statistics, mathematical economics. Okay. The fourth step, so in a way that you know how the questions have been asked by looking at previous papers. So we have prepared, once the preparation is over for any other topic, we can solve the question bank. When we have done completed all these things, this means our preparation is over. Now we'll be solving the test series. So we'll be giving separate test series for JAM and your CUT. This CUT test series will cover your SAU and JAMIA examination also. The question, the pattern of asking question in JAM is a bit different, although structure, if you look at the basic structure, it's the same. Okay. And finally, we'll be giving you CU for even for CVT examination, we'll be giving you UGC NET papers so that it can work as a question bank. Okay. So this is the overall structure that we thought of following. Okay. The next is we thought of starting the class with mathematical economics, but then we are planning that yes, we can start with micro. We'll be starting with micro, and within micro, wherever we'll need any requirement for mathematical economics, we'll be covering that also. And then again, separately at the end, after let's say micro and macro is over, then we'll coming back to mathematical economics. So this is the structure that we are going to follow. Okay. So today we are going to start again with microeconomics. Okay, we are going to start microeconomics, and within microeconomics, we are going to start with consumer theory. Okay. Some of the things that we'll study in consumer theory is similar to that of production or theory of production. Because theory of production talks about the firms, consumer theory talks about the individual consumers. Okay. Here, for consumption, we talk about the utility function. Within theory production, we talk about production function. Production function means the way in which any of the goods is to be produced. Okay. So we'll start with consumer theory. And consumer theory is one of the very basic, and you can the best book that I would refer if you want to revise anything, you have intermediate microeconomics. Intermediate micro by Halvarian. This is a standard book which is referred and being taught at the undergrad level. But one thing that we have to understand is, you know, the questions which will be prepared for the entrance examination is usually prepared by the professors or the teachers who teaches the postgraduate courses. So we might not follow Halvarian because this is very elementary. This is very basic book. Okay. So we'll be sharing the list of books that we have referred for your microeconomics. Okay. So the first thing within microeconomics that we need to look at is consumer preference. So we know that under microeconomics we study about individuals. So how individual behaves, what are their behavior pattern, what are the conditions and what are the reasons for those behaviors. Okay. So when we are talking about consumer preference, what happens is that we have, as a consumer, we consume something. So we have variety of options. Of options. There are multiple options in the real world. So the question is that how do we choose? How do we choose from various things? Therefore, we say that yes, consumer has a preference. Preference means priority or selection over other things. Priority or selection. You can talk about selection bias. So let's say we can take two examples. Uh, Ice cream, second is sweets. Okay. So some of us might think that no, we might choose ice cream, and some of us, for us, sweet is more important than ice cream. Therefore, what we are saying that some ice cream is preferred for some, and sweets are preferred for some of the consumers. So this is something that we call we can say about consumer preference. Okay. Now there are some properties about consumer preference. And we have taken one example. In the real world they will find variety of things. For example, diesel, petrol. Some of us might feel that yes, we'll be using petrol diesel car. Some of us might choose petrol car, and we have our own reasons. Okay, for those choices that we make, it's not that the reasons that we have is superior to the reasons for the people or consumers who chooses the diesel car or the diesel vehicle, but then we have our own preferences. So we are talking about preferences. Okay. So if this is preference, then what are the properties of preferences? In the entrance examination, especially in microeconomics, a lot of questions are being asked from these properties. So whatever we study, it's important to look at the properties. And what we will be doing is that throughout the classes, throughout the lectures, whenever there is a scope, where the questions can be asked. So we'll be discussing that also. So this is all about consumer preferences. So what are the properties of consumer preference? Properties of preferences. Whenever we look at some any of the properties in microeconomics, we have assumptions. Okay, and assumptions are very important for economics, not only microeconomics. We can look at international relation, we can look at development economics. Assumptions are one of the most important part. Okay, so whatever properties or anything functions, whatever we do, assumptions are something that we'll have to take care of. And in the entrance examination, they also ask questions on the assumptions. Okay, so the first properties about preference, or you can say that how do we define preferences? Defining preferences. So the first is weak preference. Weak preferences. So what are weak preferences? So weak preferences, let's say that we have a two consumption bundle, A and B. So these are two consumption bundles. So what are consumption bundles? Goods that we consume. Okay. So consumption bundles, they're goods that we consume. So we have two kind of consumption bundles. So let's again, since we have been using ice cream and sweets, okay, and sweets, okay. So we say that let's say A is better than B. Therefore, for any consumer, let's say Mr. X, A is better than B. Okay, but in addition, we add A is as good as B, meaning Mr. A, Mr. X, he is equally happy in consuming A and he is equally happy in consuming B. So there can be two things, A equal to B. The amount of happiness that a person can get by consuming A is equal to the happiness that a person can get after consuming B. Okay. So if you ask from me, I'm equally happy in consuming ice cream or sweets. Okay. For some other person, it might be the case that, okay, he is preferring ice cream, but if he doesn't get ice cream, he can consume the sweets. So we say that that's why we use this sign. Okay. Or we can use this sign. Both are the same thing. All that we want to say is that he's equally happy in either A or B. So this is your weak preference. So second is your strong preference. In the case of strong preference, what we see is not as good as. Okay. So in this case, we say that A is weakly preferred over B. However, in the case of strong preference, we say that A is strictly greater than B, or bundle A is strongly preferred over bundle B. Okay. So this is the difference between weak preferences and strong preferences. This means if a person gets, let's say, if a person gets two different options of, let's say, ice cream, again taking the same example of ice cream and sweets, a person who prefers ice cream will always prefer ice cream irrespective of sweet. So we are saying that the person is exhibiting strong preference or strong choices. Okay, that's why we say that A is preferred over consumption B. Okay. So when we are saying that yes, a person exhibits, let's say, weak preference or strong preference, can it be possible that, let's say, A is better than B, or let's say A is preferred over B and B is preferred over C? Let's say now we are talking about three consumption bundle, A, B, and C. In the case of C, let's say Coke. Okay. So B is preferred over C. And let's say C is better than A. So in this case, what is happening is that we are saying A is better than B, B is better than C. Therefore, A should be better than C also. But if you look at this part here, what we are getting is that C is better than A. So is it possible? It's possible in the real world, but then for microeconomics and all of these things to function properly and understand it properly, we talk about assumptions. So now let's study assumptions, because these assumptions are about the preferences that we make, or the kind of preferences, or what are the rules that our preferences should follow. So in a way you can say that assumptions are rules that preferences follow. Okay. So let's look at the assumptions. So the first pref- uh, assumptions about preferences is completeness. Completeness in a way means that you are in a position to compare the consumption bundle. The So the consumption bundle are comparable. Let's say we are talking about two consumption bundle A and B, and suppose we are saying that A is nothing but ice cream and B is to Europe. So these are two different categories of consumption bundle. So how can we compare it? Yes, if A is, let's say, to Australia or South Africa, South America, then we can compare between to Europe and other things. Or if B is sweets, is your sweets, then we can compare. However, if we have these two kinds of two different consumption bundle, so we cannot compare. Okay, this means when we have two bundles A and B, so it should be such that, let's say, A is better than or equal to B, or B is better than equal to A. Either of these two must be possible. So that as a consumer, as a rational consumer, I am able to compare my consumption bundle. So this means that I have all the information about the ice cream, vanilla hai, chocolate hai, whatever the kind of ice cream, I am able to compare it. I have the information. Okay. The second assumption is your reflexivity. Reflexivity says that a consumption bundle is as good at itself. Consumption bundle at least as good as itself. This simply says that A is as good as itself. So see, whenever we are doing all of these things in the entrance examination, what they might also say is that in match the following, they'll give you these kind. So these are the assumptions, and they'll on the other hand they'll give all these things and they'll ask you to match it. So this is also possible. So this is something that we need to take care of. Okay. The next thing that we need to look at is your transitivity. And sometimes they in if you look at Hungarian, they also talk about monotonicity. So which we'll be covering at a later stage. Okay. So the next is your transitivity. So this is your third assumption. So this simply says that if A is better than B and B is better than C, okay, then C can't be better than A. This cannot happen. Why? Because if we have to rewrite this, it says that A is better than B is better than C. So if A is preferred over B and B is preferred over C, then A is also preferred over C. So if A is better than B and B is preferred over C, this means that A is preferred over C. So this is something that this is an assumption, because again here I said that is this possible? In real world it can be true, but then again in microeconomics we make a assumption that this cannot be true. So this is the assumption that we make. Okay. So these are some of the assumptions about preferences. So now the question that we need to ask ourselves is that we are talking about all of these bundles. So how do we represent our preferences? How do we represent our preferences? Okay. Let's say that or sometimes let's say we consume two goods. So let's say one is ice cream. Second is, let's take the example of samosa. So as a consumer, I want to consume two things. Why we want to consume two things? Because as a consumer, if I get a preference of consuming ice cream and consuming samosa, so I'll prefer both rather than just one. We'll talk in details why do we prefer two goods, because we'll talk about diminishing marginal returns, or DMR, diminishing marginal returns. We'll talk about it. So let's first talk about indifference curve. Okay. Indifference curve. So what is indifference curve? What is it? So indifference curve is nothing but locus of all the consumption bundle that gives same level of satisfactions. Okay. Under microeconomics, see, in real world, we cannot measure satisfaction. In real world, it cannot be measured, but under microeconomics, we make an assumption not about measuring satisfaction. What are the assumptions? We can measure, and second is we can also compare. Okay, we can also compare satisfaction. Like if someone who is consuming, let's say, ice cream and let's say samosa, so we can compare the amount of satisfaction. Now, when we are talking about amount, this is possible only when we can measure, and anything which is measurable is comparable. Okay, so there is some kind of interlinkages between these two. Okay, so one thing again over here that we need to talk about is the utility. Utility is nothing but a functional form. Okay, so utility is nothing but there's a term called utils, and utils is nothing but you can talk about the value or a unit of satisfaction. Let's say we consume samosa. So how much happiness do we get? So happiness can be converted into satisfaction, and satisfaction is nothing but your utility. Okay. So unit of satisfaction, utils are the unit of satisfaction. So there are two different approaches about satisfaction. One approach says that yes, we cannot measure. Okay. And the second approach says that yes, we can measure. So what are the two approaches? Let me just give you a short hint. Cardinal and ordinal. Cardinal or ordinal. Cardinal says that we can measure utility in terms of money. Measure utility in terms of money. However, one important thing that we must remember is that money in itself has no utility. Again, this is a kind of assumption. Okay. Because why we are saying that money in itself must not have any utility? Because money, we are using money as a system to purchase goods. Rather, if we start having money as a utility, we will see that when we are saying that we are preferring two different goods, money will be always preferred over all the goods, irrespective of the amount it is, because there in that case will not have diminishing marginal returns. No, diminishing marginal returns. Why? Because irrespective of the amount of money that you can give to a person, the person will never be unhappy. But if, let's say, you're forced to eat only ice cream, if we are forced to eat only ice cream, there will be a day when we are unhappy about it, when we don't want to consume any more ice cream. But if we can get money, now money has a property of buying other things. Therefore, irrespective of the amount of money that we get, we'll never be unhappy. We can always think of, getting more and more money. So this is the problem with money, and this is again why we are saying that yes, money has no utility. Again, this is a kind of assumption, but see, this might not be true in the real world. So we have to remember this point also. Next is your ordinal. Sorry. So what are the assumptions? Again, one of the assumptions that we need to make about the consumer, that consumer is rational. Rational means the consumer is having all the senses, all the information to make the correct choice. Okay. Consumer is rational means a person will always prefer medicine, let's say, uh, food over drugs, because drug is something where we believe that yes, the consumer is not rational. Okay. So one of the way in which the cardinal has helped us is with the help of your indifference curve analysis. Okay. So sometimes we'll feel that under cardinal, there are two different ways of measuring anything: quality versus quantity. See, sometimes what happens is that you'll say that yes, the quality of, let's say, this food is better than that. So in that case, also we are measuring the quality. Sometimes we'll say that okay, 10 apples are better than, let's say, 8 apples. So here also we are measuring. Therefore, there are two different ways in which we can measure. Now the question is that can we measure satisfaction? Can, yes, we can measure the happiness part. Like I'm more happy when, let's say, I'm watching any movie, Hollywood movie, and let's say I am less happy when I'm watching any Korean movie. So in this way, at some level, I can measure or compare my level of happiness. Okay, compare this level of happiness. So one of the approaches of comparing the level of happiness is your indifference curve approach, because ordinal theory talks about this qualitative comparison rather than the quantitative comparison. Okay, so the two approaches that we'll be looking at under the ordinal approach is your indifference curve. So two approaches will be your indifference curve, and the second is revealed preference approach. Okay. So these are the two different approaches that we'll be looking at. However, we'll be looking at indifference curve approach in details because most of the consumer theory is built around this indifference curve approach. Okay. So when we are talking about indifference curve, what indifference curve and we discussed previously is that this is nothing but or locus of all the consumption bundle that gives same level of satisfaction. Of satisfaction. Okay. So under this indifference curve approach, there are two different things. We have multiple consumption bundle. We have multiple consumption bundle. Second, the constant part is your satisfaction level. Okay. So by having these two things, by defining these two things, now we need to look at again the properties. The second is your assumptions. And while studying all of these things, it's important to understand that we don't get confused between the properties and the assumptions. So these are two different things. Okay. When we'll be discussing about the indifference curve, in addition to the assumptions that we made about here, we talked about some of the assumptions of preferences like reflexivity or transitivity. In addition to these two assumptions, there is the assumption of convexity. Okay. So we'll cover this thing under the mathematical economics that what do we mean by convexity. Okay. Because we say that we make the assumption that the indifference curve is strictly convex to the origin. So we'll be discussing again what do we mean by convexity when we introduce the graphical representation of indifference curve to the origin. The second assumption that again in addition to this ordinal theory indifference curve is your continuity. That is indifference curve is continuous. So again in mathematics you might have heard about continuity and differentiability. Okay. So we'll be looking at all of these things. So let's start with the part of multiple consumption bundle. Consumption bundle. Okay. See, when we are talking about multiple consumption bundle, there are different types of goods that we use and the shape of indifference curve. I see depends upon the type of goods used. What do we mean by types of goods? So there are types of goods which are, let's say, perfect substitutes. So, in microeconomics and under consumer theory, when we talk about any of the goods, we just talk about the value term, okay, how the goods can be used. So, perfect substitute are those goods which give the same end result. Okay. So, for example, let's talk about Reload's blue pen and Cello, let's say blue pen. So, irrespective of whether the company who has produced the blue pen is Reynolds or Cello, the end result is the same. Why? Because it's the blue pen. So, this is nothing but your perfect substitutes. Perfect substitute means you can use either the Reynolds blue pen or the Cello blue pen. The result will be the same. Second is your complementary goods. Goods which are used in combination. So, what are the examples? Let's say tea and milk. To produce a cup of tea, to produce a cup of tea, we need to use both tea and milk together. So that's why used in combination. So in one of the things that we must take care under complementary goods is that when we are talking about combination, this combination is a constant combination. Meaning, if one cup of tea, let's say, requires one spoon of tea and one spoon of, or let's say, one cup of milk, in that case, to produce one cup of tea, you need one of each. What will happen if you use, let's say, 10 spoon of tea? Does it make 10 cup of tea? No. So the proportion is important in this case. Used in same proportion. Okay. Now, these are some of the examples of perfect substitute and complementary goods. Now, between these perfect substitute and complementary goods is your, you can say, uh, quasi or imperfect substitutes or just substitutes. Let's say samosa and jalebi. Someone who prefers two samosa and two jalebi together, let's say I want to eat two samosa and two jalebi. In that case, if I get three samosa and one jalebi, till the time the overall quantity is the same, I might still be happy. Okay. So these are type of goods used. Now, when we are talking about type of goods used, we are talking about the relationship. Okay. Now, again, there are different type of goods based on properties like normal, inferior, and giffen or luxury goods. So we'll have a discussion on this also at a later stage. Okay. So how do we derive the indifference curve? How do we derive the indifference curve? How do we derive that? Okay. So indifference curve is a partial representation, or you might have that under microeconomics. There are two different theories. Like at a later stage, we'll be talking about general equilibrium. Partial indifference curve is a part of partial equilibrium. Now, one of the limitation of indifference curve is that indifference curve represents different combination of two goods that can give or that gives same level of satisfaction. This means that we cannot measure, let's say, we cannot have indifference curve for, let's say, three or more goods at a time. We can have only two goods. The maximum number of goods that we can represent or find a combination to give the same level of satisfaction is two goods. So this is again a limitation also. So let's say this is good x1 and let's say good x2. Okay. So let's say this is point, or let's call it y. Okay. So that we can represent. Let's call it point A, point B, point C. So this is at point A we have x1 comma y1. At point B, let's call it x2 y2. Okay. At point C, we have, let's say, x3 y3. So what is happening is that we have three different combinations. So all these points represent combination of x and y, and this is your indifference curve. All the points represent combination. Okay. And what kind of combination? That gives same level of satisfaction. Now you might ask that how is this possible? How is it possible that the point A, B, and C, that is A is similar to B or gives same satisfaction level equal to C? How is this possible? At A we have x1 comma y1, B x2 y2, and C we have x3 y3. So, as we move from A to B, what is happening is your X consumption of X is going up, whereas consumption of Y is coming down. Similarly, from B to C, consumption of X goes further, increases, whereas consumption of Y decreases further. Therefore, what can be said to keep satisfaction constant? Constant, we must decrease consumption of one good as we increase consumption of other good. Okay, so this must be true. Otherwise, what happens? Let's say this is nothing but 10 samosa and 10 jalebi. Okay, so over here, what we are saying that let's say our samosa is increasing. So this is your samosa, this is your jalebi. So X2, we have let's say 12 samosa and 8 jalebi. We have 15 samosa, we have let's say 5 jalebi. Because if we compare, this is your point, your X1, this is point X2, this is point X3. Okay. This is your point Y1, Y2, Y3. Okay. So what we can see over here is that if we compare all these 3 points, you know, X3 is greater than X2, greater than X1. This means from A to C, our X is increasing. Similarly, if we compare the consumption point of Y1, so what we get is that Y1 is greater than Y2 is greater than Y3. Therefore, what does this mean? Y consumption of Y is decreasing. That's why we are able to maintain the same level of satisfaction. Otherwise, this is not possible. So over here, what we are saying that this is increasing, but consumption of Y is decreasing. Again, consumption of X is increasing, consumption of Y is decreasing. That's why we are maintaining the same level of satisfaction. Otherwise, this would not be possible. Okay. So this is how we derive the indifference curve. Okay. Now again in next lecture, we'll see what are the properties of indifference curve. Then how does indifference curve behave, or how can we represent indifference curve for different types of good? What are the characters of indifference curve? So all of these things will be looking in the next lecture.